Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist, starting another season of your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday weekly podcast. Why, it's hard to believe, but spring has arrived quickly this year, and it's exciting to be back in the saddle here. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about soil temperatures and conditions. Also like to talk about some challenges we've been seeing in soybean germination in late delivered soybeans. And finally, take a little bit of time to talk about early planting soybeans and how we can reduce some of our risk there. So, looking at soil temperatures around the state of Michigan right now, we look at a 4-inch depth at 7 a.m. in the morning, which is kind of the standard for measuring soil temperatures. We're seeing in the Lansing area a soil temperature of 51 degrees. Now, it's interesting about that because if we look at the 24-hour average, we're actually at 57.3 degrees and a 5-day average of 54 degrees. So when we think about, needing a 50 degree or more soil temperature for successful germination, we are truly well on our way. Now, what's also interesting is that if you look at our high soil temperature yesterday, it was up to 62 degrees. Now, when we compare that to a 10-year soil temperature average of only 52.1 degrees, it helps us understand why we are seeing just really such nice and warm conditions this year for late April. Now, as we look across other parts of the state, if we go south down to Coldwater, our temperatures are actually about 4 to 5 degrees higher than the Lansing area. Now, if I go north towards Mount Pleasant, we're only about 2 degrees less than the Lansing area. Up in the Thumb near the Bad Axe area, we're about 1 degree less than the Lansing area. And finally, over in West Michigan, near Caledonia, we're only about 1 degree cooler there, too, than Lansing area and soil temperatures. Now, at the end of the day, what this really means is that soil temperatures are probably no longer a question in our mind about whether we do or don't start planting yet this year. So, really, the more important question is about what the soil conditions are in our field. And the most important decision on whether or not to start planting this year is going to be that soil moisture. The worst thing we can do is go out there and start mudding things in. So, take some time, go out and dig up some of that soil in your fields. Look at both the drier and the wetter parts of the field and see what you've got. Grab some handfuls of soil and break it apart in your hand. If it breaks apart easily, you've probably got a good chance of getting started. But boy, if that soil just stays packed up and doesn't want to break apart, feels a little greasy, it's probably going to create that sidewall compaction. And boy, that's just the problem that keeps on giving throughout the year. And anything we can do to reduce that risk of sidewall compaction is going to help us because that crop just is never going to outgrow that damage. So as always, we've got one shot to get it right, and there is no real rush to get started. But if the fields are ready, I'm hard pressed to find a reason not to get started. So, keep in mind, equally important, we look at the forecast for the next week, and it looks like we're in on a warming trend, and it's not often we get these types of conditions this early in Michigan. So let's take full advantage of it. And as far as soil conditions, wow, that freeze thaw cycle we had this past winter has just given us some of the best working conditions of soils that I've seen in years. Now, on a different topic, you may have noticed lately that many soybean seed suppliers are dealing with some late season seed quality or lower germination issues this year. Now, that's really kind of due to those growing conditions in the fall of 2024 at harvest. And that warm, dry fall harvest season was great for harvesting dry corn, but it also caused many soybean fields to be harvested at some ultra low moisture levels. Now, this isn't ideal for selling soybeans at the elevator, and it's even worse for those raising seed beans because it can quickly lower the germination level of those seed beans prior to next year's planting. Now, at Golden Harvest, the standard is to sell soybean seed at 90% germination. And this season, though, industry wide, we'll be seeing some more seed tagged at 85 or even 80% germ. First off, all we need to understand, what does that tagging percentage really mean? Now, if you get a bag that's tagged at 85% germ, what it really means is the actual germination in that bag is higher than 85 but less than 90. So it could be 89 or 88 percent germ in that bag, even though it's got an 85% tag. So whenever the test comes back, less than that 5% increment, we have to drop to the next 5% tagging. And therefore, most of the time the germ is better than what's tagged on that bag. Now, once you do get the news that soybean maybe is tested with a lower germ, what do we do? And, do you keep the genetics and manage the lower germ, or do you switch to a different variety to try to get that 90% germ bean? And that's a good question, and it deserves to be considered. Personally, my recommendation is I'd rather take the lower germ beans and I can manage them correctly. And, but I want to preserve the genetics that I've chosen on the farm first. Now, there's a reason that we probably selected those particular varieties, and it's either that we needed that trait, maybe it's a trait like the Peking gene for cyst nematode, or maybe it's the E3 trait for our herbicide options, or maybe we've got a trait for phytophthora or white mold tolerance that we're trying to work around, and maybe it's just the maturity because we're managing possibly a wheat crop or something in there that next year. And boy, we change varieties, we give up those needed traits, and that can potentially lower some yield potential on those farms. I do get the question about seed treatment on lower germ beans, and I do believe we need to keep these beans treated. We need to do everything within our power to give every bean the chance of germinating. And yeah, we may crack a few beans in the treating process, but I'm a true believer that the benefit of the treatment far outweighs the risk. And plus, with Golden Harvest, if your beans are treated, you do qualify for the 100% replant program. So if you're doing the math on this, and let's say you've got a final stand that you want to have of 120,000 plants per acre, then you'd normally plant about 133,000 plants to get there. That's figuring that 10% potential loss in a normal 90% germ seed bag. Now, if you do plant something with an 85% germ tag, then you're going to bump those populations up a little bit, but somewhere in the 133 to 141,000 plants per acre will get you there. And of course, if you're looking at an 80% germ beans, then you're probably going to bump that up somewhere between 141 and 150,000 plants per acre. So, however, as we think about soybeans, we probably can get by with a little bit lower stand than what we typically target. In fact, a lot of our agronomy in action research has evaluated seeding rates across the Midwest. And, we come to find that the data from these trials shows no statistical yield response to higher seeding rates. In fact, the return on investment was maximized 57 to 70% of the time, with seeding rates ranging from 100 to 140,000 plants per acre, depending on the grain market price. Now, based on that data, we can handle some slightly lower stand counts with fairly minimal risk. So, what's the ideal seeding rate for soybeans, anyways? I always hate this question because, the real answer is it depends. What I will say is that research has shown that over many years, we can produce the best return on investment in soybeans with less than probably our current seeding rates. So some of the considerations for me are as follows. We think about if we have high fertility soils, we can absolutely reduce those seeding rates and should. We got high disease pressure like white mold. We want to reduce those seeding rates, get more air in that canopy. Now, if we're planting early or into wet conditions, we may increase those seeding rates, or, if we got those lower fertility soils, we absolutely benefit from increased seeding rates from normal. And probably the other area where we want to increase those seeding rates if we've got some high weed pressure and we're trying to create a little higher, faster canopy. So as always, if you want some help in dialing in that best planting rate, give me a call. We'll talk about farm by farm, field by field, and put a plan in place. So finally today, let's talk about early planted soybeans. So, we're still in the month of April, and the risk of frost in Michigan always exists in the month of May. So early planting soybeans is not without risk, but research has shown that there is also a nice potential of yield benefit from early planted soybeans. So, in order to reduce that risk, I do have a few things for us to consider on these early planted fields. In addition to making sure that your soils are in good condition for moisture and ensuring that the soil temperatures are on the rise and that the forecast for the next few days is calling for a warming trend, we should also consider our planting depth. Now, planting soybeans at a depth of 2 inches is very common and should be considered on your non-crusting soils. This will slow down that emergence process, giving you a better chance of not freezing off early for those early emerging beans. And it'll also allow for a more uniform standing emergence. That's all due to a more uniform soil moisture and soil temperature at those deeper planting levels. This is also a good time to ensure you've got a really good seed treatment on those early planted beans. We're given more time, sometimes up to 30 days in the soil for these seeds to get damaged by both insects and fungal pathogens. So protecting them with a good seed treatment can reduce your risk of that poor stand. So as we wrap up this week's Agronomy in Action Focus Friday podcast, let's make sure that we always put safety first. Turn off that equipment before working on it. Keep safety shields in place and truly watch out for people around your equipment. Accidents, they happen, but we are the first line of defense in reducing that risk for ourselves and for our families. This is Charles Scoble, your Golden Harvest agronomist. Have a great week.